Un saluto a tutti, io sono Simone Mariam di Mito Dolcino. Vi invito a mettere mi piace al video e iscrivervi al canale. Oggi è con noi un grande ospite, Matt Ehret. Matt Ehret è un giornalista, docente, fondatore della Canadian Patriot Review e scrive anche per Strategic Culture. Hi Matt, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much. I want to start the interview, I want to open the interview asking you about these strange times, because many points of reference are collapsing nowadays in credibility under the weight of ideology. Alongside institutions with already bad reputations such as politics, journalism, and justice, to which unfortunately in recent months the medical profession, schools, and even the church have been added, how can we encourage the formation of critical thinking in the new generation?
Well, this is certainly, it's a very, very strong question to start with, and I think it's a big and a very important one, which does merit some time to elaborate, but I'll try to be as concise as I can. For my part, I think that we are living through, and I think anybody listening to this interview is probably come to the conclusion that we are living through a historical moment of change. As all of these things happen historically, every time we go through a systemic change, the potential for good or for evil is very high. I was born in 1982. I would imagine that you were probably born around a similar time in the
same age.
Okay. And so we have never personally lived through one of these experiences. Those who are in their 80s and their 90s might have some memories of periods of great potential for evil. People who have seen the rise of fascism in Europe, the rise of fascism as well here in North America. I'm in Canada, and it's often forgotten that here in Quebec, where I live, we had a Quebecois Nazi party, which became very powerful in the 1930s. In the United States, there was similar rises of fascism throughout the 20s and 30s as well, sponsored by a lot of the same financial interests, a lot of the same London, Wall Street, banking houses, and institutions, foundations, which were pouring money into the rise of Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler in Europe. But they were doing the same thing here too, all for offering a very beaten down, scared, starving population a chance for economic stability for the first time after years of Great Depression. So in that sense, we are living today through something we've never personally experienced, but we do have the benefit of history. Not if you go to, of course, official history books, but nonetheless, if you actually develop a taste for rigorously piecing together the truth of history, which is very possible and very doable, and I think we've all gotten a taste of making discoveries, we could see a lot of parallels in the world that is now emerging. We have, I think, on the one hand, an awakening. There's, as we were talking before this interview began a little bit, there is a, people are beginning to wake up out of their drunken stupor, and for the first time, you know, the thing that they were able to ignore, the possibility of an economic meltdown of the system, the rise of fascism, these were things that many people had encountered, but they'd always kept it outside of their personal realities because they didn't know how to deal with it. It didn't seem to affect their jobs, their family too much. And so their comfort allowed them a little bit of a comfort blanket to continue in ignorance and just be functional day to day. And I mean, one quick example, there were surveys done on who believed in the official narrative for 9/11 in the United States in 2006. And something like 48% of the American population surveyed did not believe in the official narrative of what happened. Now, what happened to these tens of millions of people, if not more? They didn't really organize themselves to do something about the implications of what that means, that there's something controlling your government that is willing to kill thousands of your own people directly in order to create an excuse for a surveillance state inside of North America, as well as the destruction of whole nations in the Middle East. The implications are very uncomfortable. So people stayed away from the cognitive dissonances. Now, under the guise of the of the so-called pandemic, it's become more and more impossible to ignore the reality. So people are you know, I was at a recent protest against the lockdowns and against the vaccination passports just last week, and you had many dozens and dozens of nurses, of doctors, even people from fire departments were marching together with regular people, all in solidarity. Hundreds of thousands in Montreal. We're seeing this all over the world. So people definitely now are hungry for some solution to put out the fire that they've been ignoring. The fire is there, it's beginning to burn them. They're looking for water, but they don't know what the solutions are. They just don't want the fire to destroy them and their families. And so there's an opportunity now for teaching, for giving people a set of lessons that they were not prepared for in the past. And there are, thankfully, points of resistance internationally. There's some from the grassroots in the West. There are nations in Eurasia that I see that have said no to the depopulation agenda, the world government agenda. But we need to definitely take an opportunity to direct people's minds and hone their minds at this moment of change, I think. Definitely.
You spoke about the rise of the Nazi Party in Canada. Let me ask you, what is happening now in Canada?
Right now, unfortunately, somebody once said, I mean, there's a very interesting quote that I liked that said, "History does not repeat; fools repeat history." And I appreciate that quote, because people often use the George Santiago quote, which is a little bit different, but it avoids free will. And I think when you allow folly to be your guide, you will always repeat the foolishness of the past, because there's something universal about folly, which leads to our demise. And the only solution is wisdom, change, right? We have free will. We have a mind that God gave us to use. We could choose to activate it if we so wish, but it has to be there. In Canada currently, unfortunately, those governing the policies in Canada are moving us towards what I would say is a return to a new version of the same type of fascism with modern 21st century characteristics, maybe with a technocratic feudal twist. Vaccination passports have now been mandated in Quebec. It's very clear that we're currently in an election cycle, and there's no serious opposition from any of the parties who are vying for control. The Liberal Party, which is currently the dominant party, seeks a majority whereby it will be able to have whatever it wishes done with no opposition by September 20th. And at that point, it's also very clear that they will be seeking vaccination passports for across the nation. There is a witch hunting of many doctors across Canada as well, who have chosen to speak up about the inconsistency of the official World Health Organization narratives that are being pushed onto all nations. But so you definitely have a reversal of many of the civil liberties and movements towards the emancipation politically of humanity that have been made over many generations. That's all being reversed very quickly. And I think the part of the equation that I think is important to hold in mind is the economic collapse of the system. This is something that intelligent analysts have been writing about for many years. It's not something that just arose as a danger in the recent day since COVID sprang up. This is already before COVID. And I think that if you want to get a sense of the strategic use of why COVID itself was created at the time that it was because those who are controlling that narrative understand that the meltdown of the banking system of the West is inevitable, and they want to control the demolition and create the conditions, the terms of what the new rules will be that replace the current collapsing order. And they want those rules to be based on certain things that we could discuss if you'd like, but they're not very good.
Yeah, they want control demolition.
They want to control demolition, and Exactly. They want to control the emotional trauma, the shock therapy effects onto the people, much in the same way that we saw the shock therapy in the 1929 to 33 period, especially in the West, when the economic bubbles of the roaring 1920s speculation burst. And to keep this in mind, this was not something which just happened by accident. There was a controlled demolition of the banking system in 1929, which could only happen by the banking system over the course of 30 years in North America, having been turned from a future-oriented protectionist national system of economics, which it was under Abraham Lincoln, all the way through McKinley. There was an orientation towards building big projects, making money the servant of the interests of the nation by the continual investment into the future. This is what Lincoln's Transcontinental Railway was all about, which was begun during the Civil War. This continued with the idea of a protective tariff to favor the growth of local industries and agriculture so that you could stand on your own 2 feet as a sovereign nation and not have private financiers who operate above nation states dictate the terms and conditions of whether a nation can develop or not. And the answer is always not when you're in the mindset of a private central banker operating in the city of London, or using the city of London, I should say it better that way, as a tool. I say it that way because I don't think that many of the bankers, even working in the city of London, have a clue what the hell they're a part of. So just to get that across. That's not a new thing today. Today, it's the center of world finance and a lever of control, but it was the same thing in the 19th century. So going back to the Great Depression, there was a moment when people like, J.P. Morgan, all of the people in the Andrew Mellon Morgan networks who were controlling U.S. finance and economic policy, created what was called a broker call loan. On a particular day, it was arranged for all of the brokers who had been arranging call options on the speculative markets to all have to pay back the loans that they'd been using. So there'd been a lot of leverage. People had been speculating with other people's money, with savings that they had access to from the banking system. That was, things like Glass-Steagall were not passed yet. So savings, commercial banking was all tied into investment and more speculative banking. It was all mixed together, and people were able to gamble in the night. That's why they called it the Roaring '20s. It was wild. It was easy money for some. It was highly deregulated, and the brokers, again, like I said, were loaning. I think it was something like 10 cents on the dollar. So they only had 10 cents of equity for every dollar that was being used to invest in the markets for big returns. But when the broker call loans were all called in at the same time, that money didn't actually exist in any physical way. And you immediately had defaults, mass defaults that spread. You had people racing to the banks to try to pull out their money when they could see the markets were in turmoil. And that was the unleashing of the Great Depression. But it was calculated, and anybody who knew, who was orchestrating the pinprick into the bubble, they were able to sell before the bubble was burst. People like anybody on JP Morgan's preferred clients list that was later revealed in hearings in 1933-34. There were many people who were able to sell everything fast and then buy up pennies on the dollar during the Great Depression. And so this is something which was designed for several purposes. One was a wealth transfer to a small corporatocracy in Wall Street in London. The other thing was to create a psycho-spiritual trauma in the people who would then be made susceptible to accepting things like fascism as a solution to their economic woes. That was another aspect of it. And the other point to get across, just like today's Great Reset agenda, we had a Great Reset conference in 1932 that was initiated with 65 nations around the League of Nations and the Bank of England in London. It was called the London Conference, and it was designed to get rid of nation states, which was always the mandate of the League of Nations from 1919 onward. And it was essentially, in short order, to create a central bankers global dictatorship around the Bank of International Settlements that had just been created to facilitate Versailles Treaty loans, loan payments from Germany to the victor nations. This was a bank that was highly later on found to be complicit in funding the rise of Hitler as well as Mussolini, and facilitating money, gold that Hitler had confiscated from Czechoslovakia into Nazi treasuries. This was a conference which was sabotaged. Now, here's the thing that people, I find this very empowering to study this, and this is a part of my new book that's just been released, The Clash of the Two Americas. It was sabotaged because you had an anti-fascist presidency of Franklin Roosevelt who said no to world government. He removed the United States from any participation in that conference in London. And over the course of 6 months of battles, finally the conference collapsed and they could not get their banker's dictatorship as a solution. What happened instead with the collapse of the conference in, I think it was March 1933, was they had to put their investments and energy into the backup plan, which was Hitler, Mussolini, and full-blown fascism as a battering ram for a higher financier power above Hitler, above Mussolini, who wished to use them simply as strongmen to enforce a program under the obedience of a higher oligarchy. And it's very similar to a lot of the conditions even today of what's being set up. And again, I think the solutions are very similar to what was done to break this policy in 1933.
So you think a war might be inevitable?
If you stay within the rules of the current game, because up until now, there's been one great game, mostly dominant around the world from World War II to the present. Up until 1989 to 90, it was based upon certain rules that were occasionally broken of the Cold War, mutually assured destruction. These were rules that were created by figures who wished to destroy Franklin Roosevelt's post-war program, which he had arranged with Russian and Chinese and other counterparts in India, in South America, and Brazil, which we saw with anybody studying the ideas of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, if you actually look at what was the battle for those 2 weeks when it was underdefined, what would the new system be after World War II? You had two separate ideologies clashing. On the one hand, you had, as I mentioned, Franklin Roosevelt and his orientation, which was to internationalize the New Deal and to extend the success of what the United States had done with the Tennessee Valley Authority, the rural electrification. Many of the biggest projects in history were built in the 1930s. After Roosevelt had declared war on the Wall Street bankers, had broken up the banks with Glass-Steagall, had put a lot of bankers in prison for speculating illegally in the 1930s. And there was always a fight. There was never just one America. There was always two Americas at war with itself, just like today. That's the same thing then. It's the same thing as it always has been, just like there's two Italys. You know, you have a real Italy, and then you have this other thing that seems to not be, it's different, but it's
absolutely
at war.
Very different.
And I think it's the same thing for every country. So the enemies of that international New Deal were people like John Maynard Keynes, who hated the American delegation's view, and instead his assignment was to create a one world currency called the Bancorp, which is essentially a type of exchange currency that everybody had to buy into in the post-war age that would be controlled by the Bank of England. And his job was to maintain economic imperialism over the world and preserve the British Empire. FDR's objective was to break the British Empire and instead extend international development so that everybody could stand on their own 2 feet and have full industrial economic foundations, whether it's in Africa. He had programs for greening the Sahara Desert. He had programs for greening much of Arabia and the Middle East with many of his counterparts. He had programs for technology transfer to Brazil. And to really just give everybody the ability to become a sovereign, what's called a full spectrum economy, so that nobody would just be a cash cropping nation. So that didn't work. That was sabotage when Roosevelt died an early mysterious death and his allies were destroyed. Their careers were destroyed, and they were all called red commie spies like Henry Wallace or Dexter White, and many died also mysteriously, like Wendell Willkie or Harry Hopkins died very, very soon after. Harry Dexter White also died very quickly working with, anyway. So what happened was there was a takeover, and a lot of people there, I mean, this has been obscured from our history books. So not many people understand the dynamics of this fight and how the US was taken over after Roosevelt died. And this is what shaped the Cold War. Today, since the Cold War ended in one way in 1989-90, the rules of the game have been unipolar, right? The rules-based order, that's the other word for the New World Order. Everybody has to obey a one pole, which governs and shapes the system as a whole. And that, if you look at the ideology, is based upon getting rid of nation states, reducing the world population according to certain mathematical formulas that are plugged into computer models, which we are told we have to abide by to be good, sustainable creatures of the earth, which are far less than what the current population levels are. And the only reason why war is such a great danger is because many nations of the world in the East, in Eurasia especially, Russia, China, other countries that have gotten on board with the Belt and Road Initiative or the Greater Eurasian Partnership. I mean, there's about 130 plus nations who have signed on various levels to the Belt and Road Framework. It is a completely different set of rules than what we have operational in the unipolar part of the transatlantic. So these two separate systems are not compatible. One of them, I would say, is much more in harmony with the true self-interest of the species, of mankind. The other one is a perversion and an atrocity towards humanity, and is completely out of alignment of any of the natural laws of the universe that are discoverable, either moral or physical. And because this other system is not caving in, the Eurasian multipolar system, and I call it multipolar, that's what Xi Jinping, Putin have made it clear. They want a world of multipolarity, which means sovereign nation states having bilateral, trilateral arrangements, not one pole determining everything. And it's all based upon large-scale, big projects, kind of like the New Deal was in the 1930s, or what FDR envisioned for the post-war age. Big 10, 50-year projects into the future that govern the behavior of the monetary system with national controls over the banking system, which is what China still has. That's why China is there's so much effort to demonize China in the eyes of the West, because they actually kicked out George Soros in 1989. They kept sovereign control of their banking system. They didn't go for private central banking. And they're currently the target of a U.S. military encirclement around the perimeter, as is Russia. So yeah, something has got to give. And unfortunately, if the unipolar system, the one we live in, financially blows out, I think that those controlling it from above recognize that many nations in that chaos will jump onto a life raft of the alternative system of the multipolar alliance instead of going for fascism the way that they wish. So yeah, I think that the war danger is a very serious threat.
Yeah, because you mentioned the multipolar order. I wanted to get there because, as you said, we are witnessing the emergence of a multipolar order, and that's my opinion, and the implosion of the unipolar order. Maybe it's more a clash, but how do you think the balance of power in the world will change after the Afghan crisis? What is the position of Iran and India in this scenario? And will China, in your opinion, benefit from this crisis?
Well, that's
a complex question. I know it's complicated.
Oh yeah, you're asking good thick questions. That's good. No, from my assessment of things, looking at there's two levels. If you just look with your senses at what's happening in Afghanistan, you'll have one picture that's also being amplified by some of the media narratives, that picture that we're being sold is the following. Biden has abandoned his British allies who are now angry. Tony Blair is shaking his fist saying you've betrayed the cause. Very vocal, right? Dominic Raab as well has been saying the American, all of this toil and effort has been for nothing. You have abandoned us, America. And BBC is constantly projecting these images. We're being told in the mainstream media here that Biden is just another nationalist like Trump who only cares about ending forever wars, but isn't really a true internationalist. He doesn't really love peace. So we're being given these narratives. I don't believe any of that. I think that knowing the nature of the beast that's controlling us, I don't think that empires ever change their essence. They might change their techniques of manipulation, but they don't change their essential character. It's like a cat, right? Whatever environment you put a cat in, it will behave like a cat. It won't start thinking that it's a bird. So what I do see is evidence of two things. On the one hand, the US is completely lost. The Anglo-American faction running Afghan policy as well as Syrian policy has overplayed their hand. Russia, China, especially, have completely transformed the environment of the game in that zone. Especially now that Iran is on board, and Iran has signed, a $500 billion deal over 25 years with China. There's a similar deal with Russia over security, energy, and economic programs. So, you've got a very strong set of cultures working together that have shaped the environment of the Middle East. China has programs for extending the Belt and Road, the new Silk Road programs through the Middle East, through Afghanistan, through the Pakistan economic corridor, into Afghanistan in a number of ways, Afghanistan, as well as through Iran into Iraq, potentially. Iraq is still a major control zone, which is being controlled by Western interests, but who knows how long that could stay. Syria is very, very interested. Obviously, their only hope for survival is through Chinese investments in reconstruction of infrastructure. Same thing for Lebanon and many other countries that would extend zones of development all the way into Europe, but also with branches into Africa, frankly. So you have a great opportunity for reconstruction, but you have, and this is the final point to keep in mind with the mind's eye. I said, if you believe the senses, you won't understand this. But if you look at what the American military industrial complex and the British have been doing, is I think preparing for, on the one hand, exiting with their old school military techniques from Afghanistan. However, there is an increased program of asymmetrical warfare and destabilizations using an increased rate of support for Al-Qaeda, things like ISIS-K, the K variant of ISIS, which has all of a sudden been created in Afghanistan, where they hope to suck. They know that China will fill that vacuum in Afghanistan in a variety of ways, but they're now, I think we could expect to see an increase of terrorist attacks on Chinese investment firms and firms operational there, supported by the U.S. The U.S. is there's a recent article that was very well done, featuring receipts purchased by the U.S. from 8 military production firms in former Soviet states, in Georgia and others. Bulgaria, I think, was one, where there's billions of dollars of arms, which are very hard to identify the source of the arms because they're using the old designs from the Soviet era, that are being sent in to flood Syria, to flood Afghanistan, with all sorts of support like that. So I think that you have this happening as well. And Britain is trying to project it. I mean, the way I see it, British intelligence is firmly in control of Biden's administration. And they're playing a game of making it seem like there's America going renegade and then their betrayed London cohorts. I don't see that. I see that this is purely a perception management game. It's not real.
You mean a mirror game?
A mirror game, smoke and mirrors, yeah.
Speaking about the multipolar world, could you just briefly tell us what you think about the relationship between China and the United States right now? In one of your articles in Strategic Culture in November last year, you talked about the title was "Case of China." No, the subtitle of was "The Case of China, Producer of the World," mentioning that China could be the first country the next decades to land on the moon, build permanent bases, and mine helium-free. I'd love for you to tell us first about the China US relationship, and then if you briefly try to tell us something about China's space plans and also the US plans, if you can.
Sure. Militarization versus real development. I mean, space has historically been one of the most exciting places economically, which under saner times before you and I were born, there was a certain dynamic, especially in the 1960s, because of the fight that John F. Kennedy had waged with a small network of allies, that the space program, NASA, became, I mean, at their highest in 1965, the budget was 4% of US GDP was spent towards the objective of the space program, putting a man on the moon. It drove the entire economy. I mean, it's hard to calculate because it was so nonlinear in conducting this type of long-term mission that there was no solution for when JFK uttered those words. It resulted in so many explosive discoveries that manifested in forms that we could never have calculated before it happened. Only in hindsight can we sort of like reverse engineer and figure out what occurred. GPS, the internet, medical technologies, MRIs, CT scans, materials processing, the creation of new types of materials, polymers and other things all grew out, which had massive industrial production effects, all grew out of the space program as a driving force of increasing the density of because this is the thing with human economy versus other animals. The key source to human economy is how fast can we efficiently not just encourage the creation of new discoveries in the laws of nature, but translate those discoveries into the overall productive process that sustains human life. And that's what allows human beings to go from very low carrying capacities 2,000 years ago, where we had maybe a few 100 million of our species, 300 million maybe on the Earth. And it couldn't be much more than that, even if we wanted to, in the Bronze Age, let's say. When you had the discoveries of metallurgy that allowed for the creation of the Iron Age, that gave you a greater power to sustain more people. New discoveries were applied also in agriculture. New techniques were innovated. And then it really, really blossomed with a big explosion of discoveries in the Renaissance of Italy that had all sorts of effects everywhere else. And this is sort of something that we saw, I mean, with Brunelleschi's dome in Florence. You know, that was 200 years to build this incredibly impossible thing. But just look at what came out of that project that Dante Alighieri got into motion. And it took so long. Generations. But under Brunelleschi's leadership, you had people like a young Leonardo da Vinci who learned his trade. He learned how to build machines, I mean, so many discoveries were made in aesthetics, arts, engineering, you name it. And the idea of applying this to benefit human life in all sorts of ways grew out of that. And so, you know, many of these, and I'm doing a circuitous path here because I'm going to get back to the point at end of the space program, I promise you. But there's, you know, the point is that I'm just thinking about here, the social engineers who benefited from feudalism, where human beings were kind of like cows on a plantation that were never allowed to leave their controlled environment that a lord controlled, they were threatened by this new age of discovery where children like Da Vinci, who didn't come from noble families of special bloodlines, demonstrated that they had a superior capacity to think creatively and make discoveries that all of these entrenched, educated, cultured oligarchs did not have as a capacity. And they also liberated people to want to not be satisfied in their controlled cages in the feudal estate. They hungered for something greater. They became uncontrollable. So this has been something which oligarchs have they've despised. I would say a Brunelleschi type project in the 20th century is comparable to the Apollo space program that was discontinued in 1973. It was destroyed over the dead bodies of many patriots like JFK, like his brother, like Martin Luther King, like many others. Enrico Mattei earlier on in 1961 had a vision of using investments into large-scale projects for Africa to help Africa develop big things that would ultimately create a condition where imperialism could not sink its tentacles and exploit the continent the way it has over the past 60 years. So today, China has picked up the torch that was dropped by the United States and the West in the 1970s. Apollo, like I said, was completely canceled. It was gutted. The capsules, the Saturn rocket, a lot of the cutting edge technology, the rocketry, nuclear rocketry as well, that was being invested in the 1960s, it was all canceled. The capsules were put into warehouses, museums, everything was canceled. And the US just stopped pretending. And the story that we were given was, well, the space program was really just about beating the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There was nothing more than that. Now that's not true. John F. Kennedy and many others had a program for using this as the springboard to something much bigger that would tie humanity's economic destiny to the infinite expanses of exploring the universe. So when we went into a consumer society, what's called zero industrial growth program, so in the 1971 period was when the US was completely taken over in so many ways by the Trilateral Commission, people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, who ran the Trilateral Commission. They brought in a doctrine of zero technological growth, post-industrialism, and consumerism. And the idea was the US was going to now, in the new age, no longer produce. Poor countries were going to produce, like China, maybe Mexico, who would stay poor, and we would just be consumers in the West. And we abandoned all of our cutting edge investments, and we went stagnant. And we could just see the collapse of sanity over the past 40 years. Everything became deregulated. The banking system became deregulated. The creation of too big to fails was the effect of these mergers and acquisitions. You had speculation, fictitious capital take over control of the system like a cancer, while the investments into infrastructure, productive things that sustain human life, that was all destroyed year to year. It just got worse and worse. And all sorts of cultural, spiritual side effects occurred. Suicides, drug use, other things you could imagine, all increased in like. So China and increasingly Russia have a bond of survival where they have picked up the legacy. And even though China was kicked out of any arrangements to cooperate with the United States under Barack Obama in 2011, they were no longer allowed to work on the ISI, the International Space Station. They basically said, well, let's just do this ourselves then. And China and Russia have signed an agreement to jointly build a lunar base together. That's already in operation. They have landed on the far side of the moon, and they've landed their first rover on Mars. They have a program to begin mining the far side of the moon for helium-3, which is only useful for, it's something found as an isotope abundantly on the moon. It's not on the Earth at all because of our magnetic field is so strong. But the moon has no magnetic field, so it's been accumulating helium-3. This is the most efficient fuel for fusion power, which China has a great ambition to excel in, which will completely transform the idea of limits to growth. What is a resource? Everything changes. And so the US policy currently for space is militarization mostly. Under Trump, there was two opposing space programs. One was the civilian positive side of space of NASA that we saw with the Artemis Accords, which were premised around the idea of respecting sovereign nation states, cooperating on jointly developing lunar, asteroid, Mars, other resources together, and not militarizing space according to the 1967 treaty that was reaffirmed under the Artemis Accords. But then you had this other Space Force deep state policy over space, which was to simply extend geopolitics and warfare into space with cyber warfare and other things involved. So now today, I think that second one, unfortunately, has become the dominant space policy of the West.
You mentioned Trump. What's Trump's role in this big scenario?
I think Trump was, I followed him very closely, and I didn't have a high hope at the beginning for what Trump would do. But when I began to follow, and I think most people looking were a bit surprised to see the amount of work that Trump had done, which I find is somewhat miraculous in the short time that he was in there as the president. He did undermine many of the things that took decades, if not longer, to put into place, like NAFTA was scrapped, where he gave sovereign nations of North America the right to control protectionism, their own economic destiny, which they did not have legally as a right under NAFTA. That's the North American Free Trade Agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership as well was scrapped, which was an attack on China, an isolation of China, and a creation of a new corporatocracy to give corporations the right to sue nations if they disobey a free trade agreement. And also just destabilizing NATO, separating the CIA from the military, were things that Trump had done. He made a lot of motions far before people realized to begin negotiations with the Taliban as well on creating an exit strategy. So there are many things. And also, I could make a list. I don't want to make a list, but I think he really was and continues to, in a certain way, to be a destabilizing factor for the script that the oligarchy has been following under their idea of a technocratic depopulation world government. I think Trump's missteps really became terrible after COVID was launched, and many of the people who surrounded him and shaped much of his perception of what was the cause of COVID were people who were influenced by the Bannon, Epoch Times, Richard Dearlove sort of network. And Richard Dearlove was the former head of MI6, who, by the way, became one of the first vocal promoters of the China evil, China's genetically created the coronavirus to destroy Western civilization. And he did that very early on. Now, Richard Dearlove was also, ironically, one of the key guys controlling Christopher Steele and who ran Russiagate to try to destroy the Trump presidency for 4 years. So you had these strange characters, who all of a sudden became very influential. Their opinions became very influential under the confusion of what the economic shutdown of the economy was under COVID. So Trump began burning bridges that I think he needed to have in place if the U.S. was going to survive the oncoming storm. The U.S., I don't see how the U.S. can do it by itself. It's too compromised. And I think the U.S. really does require the cooperation and assistance of other nations defending national sovereignty, like Russia, China, and others who wish to work on building big projects together. So currently, I'm not too sure of Trump's role in things at this moment strategically. I do hope that there are things in the works that I don't fully understand that could maybe offer some hope in the US, but I don't know.
So you're basically saying that Trump realizes that the emergence of a multipolar world is inevitable.
Oh, I think that he had a better grasp of this before coronavirus, and he had made many signs to both his Russian and Chinese counterparts, calling for, like, for example, in May 3rd, 2019, he had the Chinese, I forget if it wasn't the ambassador, I think it was somebody representing the foreign ministry in the White House, in the Oval Office, and they did a press conference from the Oval Office where he bypassed the entire State Department. He just invited this person directly in. And that was the good thing about Trump, is he liked taking a personal hands-on approach, whereas like a Biden or an Obama character or Bush, they need everything controlled for them. They're not sovereign personalities. So Trump was a bit different in that sense. And he made this speech where he basically said, Russia, China, the US together should be putting their hundreds of billions away from military affairs and into building things together that benefit all of us. And many people were very confused and shocked by this. But I think that Trump definitely, and he does represent a building tradition. Like, he did make a career off of building things. That was a big part of his identity. And he spoke very highly of China's ability to carry out big projects like magnetic levitation rail, high-speed rail, which the U.S. has hardly anything. I think 100 kilometers, barely. Canada is 0. China, 34,000 kilometers, and it's going to be doubled soon. So he did express an admiration for China's ability to build big things, which he wished the US could be able to do. And the offers that China has made since 2014, especially to invest in US infrastructure, I think are vital, because the Chinese are controlling something like, what, $3 trillion of US treasuries that are useless. They're worthless. The US is on the verge of a hyperinflationary blowout. Their debt is worth nothing. So China was and is still, they're sitting on a lot of it. That's what's been keeping the US from collapsing so far, is China and Japan buying up a lot of their debt. And they would like to infuse some value into the US debt. And the way to do that is to turn the debt into, like what Alexander Hamilton did after the American Revolution. He turned the unpayable US war debts incurred during the 6 years of the war against the British Empire into a federalized productive debt that was tied to building big projects like the Erie Canal, the biggest infrastructure project in history, was built, and it gave value back into the debt, and it gave value to the money. So the buying power increased, all sorts of things increased. And that's largely what Franklin Roosevelt did under the Great Depression too. He took debts, and instead of them just being passive inflationary debts, he put the debts to work by investing it in productive capital, in productive investments. So that's largely what China's expressed as a willingness. And I've got many quotes and citations from many of their representatives saying, like, let's just help you invest in infrastructure, and why don't you invest in, Belt and Road, New Silk Road projects with us together? And instead, what we've seen, I think Trump was moving in that direction, whereas Biden has instead spat in China's face and has said, no, we're going to create an anti-Belt and Road, build back better for the world international Green New Deal as a response to China. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's completely insane.
Absolutely. You mentioned inflation. My last question is, do you think this hyperinflation would affect the EU? And do you think this hyperinflation will lead the EU to a big fall?
To a big what?
Do you think the hyperinflation will make the EU fall?
Oh, fall.
Fall. Sorry. Do you think it will be one of the consequences might be the fall of the EU?
Yeah, I mean, it's
because we all hope
this is not an accident. Like this was forecastable.
Okay.
And if you go back even as far as Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1978 at Warwick University in London, he gave his first speech announcing the need for a controlled demolition of the world economy. Now, he was, people say, referring only to the inflation that was out of control of the 1970s. That's what they say. And so he was saying we need a controlled demolition just to deal with the inflation, and that was what the interest rate spikes to 20% were really all about. No, he worked with the Trilateral Commission. He was a part of that operation. It was a David Rockefeller operation, which was always, and you could just go to the writings of Henry Kissinger, go to the writings of Zbigniew Brzezinski from his Between Two Ages, America and the Technotronic Age in 1970. But just look at what they were doing. Their intention was to always transform the once productive industrial economic zone of North America that had grown immensely in the 30 years after World War II, and to transform it into a walking, ticking time bomb that would self-implode. That's what happens every time you take a productive economy and you turn it into a bubble. So they knew what they were doing. And you could see people like Maurice Strong, one of the architects, a Canadian, who was one of the Rockefeller operatives brought into a high position of command as an upper level management in the United Nations, working very closely with George Soros, with Lord Malik Brown and others. And he even said it in 1990 in an interview that I think it was with Elaine Dewar, an author, that world leaders should be have the responsibility of inducing the collapse of industrial civilization to protect the environment. And he said, in that interview, he's musing about a book he might like to write. But I mean, you could see this is more than just a musing of a book. He says, would people accept the need to destroy their industrial civilization to save the environment? No, they would never democratically do it. So the responsible, enlightened world leaders realize that they have to do it themselves. Those who are responsible are people like him, who manage things like the World Economic Forum, because he was also a big controller of that. So you have had an ongoing agenda to, again, create sort of an economic weapon of mass destruction, and that's the derivatives bomb, the derivatives bubble, which Alan Greenspan normalized and legalized in 1987 when the economy was about to explode in October of 1987. We're on the verge of a complete economic meltdown. The stock markets lost 25% of their value in a day. And Greenspan's solution after a 3-day series of emergency meetings was to expand the use of derivatives contracts under what he called creative financial instruments, things you used to go to jail for if you were, people in the early 80s like Michael Milken. That became all of a sudden a normal form of practice to, create different ways of betting on the insurance, on securities and other, securitized debt contracts, or anything could be bundled, turned into a security, given an insurance, and gambled upon the price of what that might be. That created a monstrosity whereby it went, by 1991, the quantity of derivatives had amounted to about $2 trillion. The world GDP was still about 600 trillion. Globally, measurable. By 1999, when Glass-Steagall was destroyed as Clinton's last act in office, and the banks were allowed to fully merge together again in the United States, the derivatives contracts had grown to over $70 trillion. By the time that the consequences of the deregulated banking system and over-the-counter derivatives and other things resulted in the foreseeable blowout in 2007, 2008 of the housing market, they had grown to $650 trillion. Today, it's hard to even measure what they are because it's so opaque. It's so difficult to even have an audit of what the derivatives are. But I've seen conservative estimates put them upwards at $1.5 quadrillion, which is about 20 times more than the official GDP. This is what is being bailed out by infinite money printing when we bail out too big to fails, or we look at what we've done under COVID. It's all fake. None of it is real. And there's so many points of triggers in the economy where you could have a default in commercial loans that have been bundled. In housing market, subprime loans, again, have not gone away. They've not been resolved. Nothing's been resolved. And there's so many points where you could have a trigger reaction default and deleveraging of the system at the same time so it's kind of like a mix between 1929 and 1923 Weimar. It's sort of like a mix of both worlds, which we've never seen before.
Don't you think this big bubble will play against the same people who create this bubble? Don't you think it will be?
I think so. I mean, I think that they're operating. Those who are creating the bubble have been operating in a bit of an ivory tower fantasy land where the New World Order might look good on paper. It might look like a very easy thing to bring about as a script, but reality never works the way an ivory tower mathematician wishes reality work. Reality is much more rich and nonlinear, as we're seeing now with the emergence of the multipolar alliance, which is again completely outside of the script. And yes, I do think that if you read Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death, it's a wonderful story that I think gives people a clinical insight into the psychology of all oligarchs who think this way, where this feudal lord and his fellow oligarchs have in Edgar Allan Poe's story, they've basically locked themselves into a gigantic castle where they are just basically going to live out a complete plague of that's ravaging Europe. And it's the effects, the consequence of their economic policies has resulted in a complete breakdown of civilization, plague, mass death. I mean, it's terrible. And they think in their delusion that they can simply live with infinite wine and orgies in balls all the time. And ultimately, you got to read the story, but it doesn't work out that well for them. But that's always what happens. The empire thinks like a parasite that they could just latch on and suck their host dry. But the parasite can do only one thing, which is do things which lead to the destruction of their host. And at that point, the parasite doesn't benefit ever by the collapse of civilizations, whether it's the Roman Empire collapsing, whether it's the Venetian Empire for 1,000 years, which ended up also overextending itself and destroying it. The elites never benefit. So I think you're right. I don't think that they will benefit at all by the consequence.
I think so, because if the hyperinflation will destroy the EU, what is left to them? I mean, the EU is the last resort they have, I suppose. One of the alongside with the US, maybe Canada, but these are the last post they have. After that, I mean, what will be left to them? I mean, hopefully. Absolutely. I mean, I would prefer a big crash once, that's it. And after you reconstruct the world, then these long-lasting and tiring and exhausting war, like perception war. That's my own opinion, Anyway.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think at this point, I was talking with my wife a little bit just the other day about this very topic, and it's like the Western population has become has been living in a delusion for so long. We've lost so much that in many ways, I think a certain smack of reality is needed to remind us that there is consequences to our own folly. Even if the folly was put into motion before many people alive today were born, despite that, we tolerated it, and there's such a thing as sins of omission or commission. The inaction, the unwillingness to act on morality is just as much of a sin as doing wrong. In many ways, there's maybe instances where you could find, outlier like reasons why, good excuses, but still, I think that we are now in a state where, while I think an economic collapse, a shock is needed. We don't want to destroy the civilization either. Like, it has to be done in such a way that people are given and see an opportunity for acting in accordance with natural law, instead of not accidentally, but instead of falling into the trap of doing what people in Germany or Italy did, which was accept fascism as their solution to helping them put bread back on the table to feed their kids out of fear.
I can see that risk as well.
Both dangers, right? The future is very underdefined.
Yeah, definitely. But anyway, well, thank you very much. You provided us with a lot of information today. Thank you. We want to thank you for your opinions, your insight. And as we said before, you will be always welcome to our channel, and you have our support 100%. Okay, Matthew?
And
anything you need, we are here.
Okay, great. And no, thank you for putting this project together, and I'm very happy to be on board, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.